Morning, morning, morning. Good morning. Good morning to you.
Let's look now at our conversations on CARICOM and welcome Barbados Ambassador to CARICOM, His Excellency David Comissiong. Ambassador, good morning.
Morning, Pearson.
Good to see you yet again. Now, the Prime Minister, not just as chair of CARICOM, but as a global leader, sets agenda. And I know at the beginning of the year, she would have issued a message to CARICOM as the incoming chair of CARICOM. And in that message, she made some very profound statements, one of which deals with our relationship with another global partner. Let's take a look, first of all, at that speech, and then I want to hear your comments thereafter.
We're also welcome as a community to welcome the declaration of the second decade for people of African descent beginning today, the 1st of January, 2025. This achievement reflects the tireless advocacy of our region and the strides made during the first decade, including global recognition of our 10-point plan for reparatory justice and the establishment of the United Nations Permanent Forum for People of African Descent. Yet, my friends, so much remains to be done in this area. We must continue to press the international community for a mature face-to-face conversation at all levels so that we may see them repair the damage from the exploitation through the immoral institutions of slavery and colonialism which our people suffered from. We must also urge the international community to provide resources necessary to improve the dignity, security, and material conditions of African-descended people worldwide. The spectacle of 600 million Africans without electricity in an age of AI is in no way morally acceptable to us as a community, which is part of the African diaspora that is the sixth region of Africa. Yes, us CARICOM people. In this regard, we will further continue our work to strengthen our relationship with the African Union as a community of Caribbean people.
That's Prime Minister of Barbados and the head chair of CARICOM, Amor Mottley, as she addressed CARICOM at the beginning of the year. And so, Ambassador, there's a lot to unpack in just those few seconds that we just shared with everyone. Particularly, let's start with the whole declaration of the decade for people of African descent.
Yes, it's so significant that Prime Minister Mottley, at the beginning of her chairmanship, signaled very clearly that this relationship with Africa and this commitment to Pan-Africanism, global Pan-Africanism, is going to be a priority for her. And she immediately zeroed in on this UN International Decade for People of African Descent, this second decade that is beginning. And she made the point that she placed Barbados and CARICOM right at the center of that initiative because, truth be told, that the first UN decade really came out of the World Conference Against Racism that Barbados played such a big role in 2001 in Durban, South Africa. And she quite rightly said that two of the great achievements of that decade were, one, the advancement and popularization of the CARICOM 10-point reparatory justice campaign, because CARICOM really, at the beginning of the decade, launched this reparations campaign, which has sparked a revival of the reparations movement worldwide. And then she singled out the establishment of the United Nations Permanent Forum on People of African Descent, which is this new UN entity that has been given responsibility for really overseeing the agenda, the development and human rights agenda of all people of African descent. And we, CARICOM, we have 2 seats in that 10-person commission. So that forum, we occupy 20% of the seats in that forum, which is a real tribute to a small region like CARICOM. And the importance of this second decade is that while we made some achievements in the first decade, we recognize that there's so much still to be done. And at a time when so many old battles seemingly have to be fought all over again, at a time when we are seeing so many reversals of achievements that our African American brothers and sisters, for example, made over the decades. We see them now having perhaps to fight those battles all over again. It is really saying to us that we need to embrace this UN decade. We need to embrace this next 10 years, and we need to make it a golden age of Pan-Africanism, a golden age of developing relations in the Pan-African world, CARICOM, African Union, the Caribbean, Africa. And I am so pleased that the Prime Minister sees this as a priority, and she has signaled this at the very beginning of her chairmanship, the very beginning of this year. And I can tell you, Pearson, that immediately she's going to have an immediate opportunity to really fast track this, because the African Union has invited her to address all of the leaders, the 55 leaders of Africa, at their Heads of Government Summit in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, next month. So she's going to have a perfect opportunity to set the agenda, to put on the table, the critical issues that need to be addressed if we're going to build this Africa-Caribbean relationship.
When I looked at the first international decade for people of African descent, I wanted to see what the objectives were, to be reminded of it. It talked about promoting respect, protection, and fulfillment of all human rights. I think that continues. To promote a greater knowledge of and respect for the diverse heritage, culture, contribution of people of African descent to the development of societies. And we see how we're doing that in movement of people to Africa and to the Caribbean. They also said to adopt and strengthen national, regional, and international legal frameworks according to the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action and the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination to ensure full and effective implementation. Are we there yet on that third objective?
Well, the overarching theme was acknowledgement of Africans and people of African descent, justice for Africans and people of African descent, and development. Those were the overarching themes. And our Prime Minister pointed out that there are still 600 million people on the African continent who don't have access to electricity, as she said, in an age of
AI.
Artificial intelligence. And that speaks to an unfinished agenda, because we know that Africa was ravaged by centuries of a slavery system, a European-imposed slave trade, slavery, colonization, and that significant damage was done to Africa's civilization, and that much of that damage still exists. So and this is why there was such a demand for a second decade, because we were not satisfied. First of all, we were not satisfied that the United Nations itself, the United Nations declared the decade, but then did little to make sure that the decade produced the kinds of results that it really needed to produce. And I think what was lacking for much of that decade was that we did not have a central UN agency overseeing it and driving it. Towards the end of the decade, we got the establishment of the UN Permanent Forum for People of African Descent. But we needed really to get that at the beginning. So that came on board about 2 years before the end of the decade. So it's had limited scope to really achieve. But the UN Forum then led the call for a second decade. And so we now have a full 10-year period before us, ahead of us, with a UN entity in existence now to oversee and to drive that process. And the Prime Minister signaled very clearly that one of the objectives of this next 10-year period must be reparations. And the CARICOM approach, the CARICOM approach has been very reasonable. We have simply pointed out the facts of history, the fact that damage was done, And we have said to these European governments that were involved in slavery and slave trade, look, come and sit with us and let us discuss what role you can play to help repair some of this damage. And a very reasonable, rational approach. That approach thus far has really been rebuffed by the governments. Yes, you've had some families and some institutions showing that moral conscience,
Right.
but the governments, and there's a lesson in this because things don't stand still. Either you are moving forward to greater justice, new and more elevated relationships, or you don't stand still, or you're going to go back. And we are seeing signs of regression, right?
Yes.
We don't have to be very specific, but we are seeing signs of regression to some of the most backward ideas and values. So I hope that message sinks in. When we launched the Reparations campaign in 2013, Pearson, we said the 21st century must be a century of reparative justice, where we must take these old relationships that were based on, victimization and oppression, and we must take them and elevate them now and take them to a new quality of brotherhood and solidarity, etc. And that's what we want. And the world will either move in that direction or it will regress. So we have a decade now, hopefully, that common sense and reasonableness and humanity will prevail. And at the end of this decade, we will not be saying that there are still 600
Yes.
Africans without access to electricity.
Something we think is so basic to our ability to do what we do. But she also ended in her comments about Africa speaking to the African Union as a community of Caribbean people. I think that's a very interesting statement. What do you see that to be?
She's saying the Caribbean is attached to Africa as a sixth region,
Right.
the diaspora. Well,
Right.
The African Union some years ago, the Africa is divided into 5 regions, east, west, north, south, central. And some years ago, the African Union said, look, there's a 6th region of Africa. And that 6th region is the diaspora. So we Caribbean people, with a majority population who came from the African continent, we are considered to be part of that 6th region of Africa. And I think we have recognized that for us going forward, developing the relationship with Africa has to be a priority. That's our ancestral homeland. The people who intended to keep us weak tried to make a break between us and that ancestral homeland. And we have to have the good sense to reverse that and to come together as a people. And, and we are doing so, Pearson. As I said, the African heads of government have invited Prime Minister Mottley to come and speak to them at their heads of government summit. But some breaking news I have for you. I just got this missive from the permanent mission of the Republic of Benin to the United Nations a couple of days ago. And it is speaking about a very important meeting of foreign ministers of CARICOM and Benin,
Right.
that was held in Benin on the 8th of January. And they have agreed that CARICOM and Benin is this country on the west coast of Africa, right next to Nigeria. Many of our Caribbean people during the period of slavery were brought from Benin. But it has been agreed that there will be a special relationship between CARICOM and Benin. And in fact, the foreign ministers will meet every 2 years, sometime in Benin, then in a CARICOM country. So this is all testimony to that vision, that Pan-African vision of developing the relationship with Africa. And of course, Barbados has established embassies in Ghana and Kenya, and we are working with Rwanda on developing a life sciences industry in Barbados. So this should send a message to us, because that new life sciences industry is going to be is going to be the most recent new addition to the economy of Barbados. And we are partnering with an African country to help us develop our high-tech industry in Barbados. So it is sending a message to us that there's so much for us to gain, us Barbados, us CARICOM, in a relationship with the continent of Africa. 55 nation states, 1.4 billion people. We have to establish that direct airline link between the Caribbean and hopefully Barbados and the west coast of Africa. We have the Afri-Exim Bank, African Export-Import Bank, headquartered right here in Barbados. So all of the pieces are really coming together nicely at the start of this new international decade for people of African descent. For us, a good wicket is being prepared that we can bat on and score some serious runs over the next 10 years.
I like your cricketing analogy, but it seems exciting times ahead. Stick around to find out the result of the exciting match. Thank you, Ambassador Comissiong, as always.
My pleasure.
For engaging conversations on CARICOM, and we do look forward to what we're going to talk about next week excitedly, because Barbados is leading the way. The Prime Minister has signaled clearly that we've got to move in the direction of forming closer relationship with the continent of Africa. We are, after all, peoples of African descent in this decade. We look forward to the exciting changes. Thank you, Ambassador.
My pleasure, Pearson.
You're welcome.
Morning, morning, morning. Good morning. Good morning to you.